All right, what we're going to talk about today is agricultural policy. And so what I'd like to do first is just motivate a little bit um, to discuss how this fits in to the broader themes of the course as well as talk about it in the political realm. A couple of different things I think about when I think about agricultural policy in the U.S. And then talk about the goals and specifics of ag policy in general. Talk about specifically price supports, price stabilization, ways of increasing farm income, and then the final thing that I want to talk about is some of the more the newer topics. Talk a little bit about ethanol subsidies, GMOs, and the TPP. Something that if you paying attention to the presidential primaries, it seems like all of the candidates are kind of focusing a little bit of their attention on the TPP right now, even though it's a very, very dense treaty, but it also has things in there that are relevant to agricultural policy. So we're going to mention it briefly today and then talk more about it possibly on, I guess on Thursday we're going to start talking about trade a little bit. So the first thing is just think about the motivation. There are two different things I think about when I think about agricultural policy. The first one goes way back to the year 2000 and the Senate race for the junior senator in the state of New York. So who won this? Who became the junior senator from New York in 2000?
Wasn't it that guy that got kicked out for confessing to smoking crack?
For Anthony Weiner?
No, you're thinking about Anthony Weiner. He was a congressman, not a.
He
he
was from
had
New
some
York
other things
though,
going on.
right?
What's that?
He was from New York though.
He was from New York, that is correct.
The guy that smoked crack was the mayor of Toronto.
Yeah, that's the mayor of Toronto. He just died last week.
Did he?
Yeah, Rob Ford died last week. 46 years old or something like that. He got cancer, and yeah, he was looking terrible. It was actually Hillary Rodham Clinton who won, became the junior senator from New York in the year 2000. And in that year, she had a residence in New York City, right? But she didn't really have any connections to upstate New York, right? She had a residence in New York City only because that's where she started moving in order to become to launch her own political career after being first lady. And so she had a residence in New York City, hadn't really traveled much outside of that, and she goes up to visit all the farms, right? Because this is what people do, right? So they go out and meet the farmers. And so she goes up there, and one of the first questions that they asked her, this group of reporters, that said, "Are you for or against the compact?" And so what the compact was, it was a trade compact. It was an agricultural system where all the dairy producers in New England and parts of New York and New Jersey had to be members of the compact in order to be able to sell their milk locally. And what it was essentially a way of raising prices on milk in order to guarantee a certain level of farm income for the dairy farmers. Okay? And she goes up there and she's like, I've thought about this for a while and I've decided I'm for the compact. I just never before had known how many farmers, dairy farmers there are in the state of New York, and I really want to support the small farmers in America, right? Okay, so there are dairy farmers in the United States, right? No doubt, there are lots of dairy farmers. You go to Wisconsin, you go to New York, you go to New Jersey, you go to Massachusetts, other places. There are going to be dairy farmers. What are there else a lot of?
Corn.
There's a lot of corn, that's true. But even more than dairy farmers or corn farmers, what do we have a lot more of instead of dairy buyers? A shitload more people drink milk than produce milk, right? And if you're charging more for milk, that may raise farm incomes, but what does it do to everyone who drinks milk? It makes them a little bit poorer, right? And so this is a classic case of where you have a hidden cost where everyone's milk costs 15 cents more per gallon. No one really thinks much about that 15 cents. But if you multiply it across the number of people that are drinking milk, it causes huge losses to society. And who gets the benefit of that? A relatively small number of people that produce milk, right? And so that's very indicative of the way we form our agricultural policy, where oftentimes we're trying to support small farmers, that's the idea behind it at least, in order to raise their incomes, but we end up hurting everybody else because we're protecting this one group's income rather than supporting all the people that consume these dairy products. So that's one of the things to think about. The other thing to think about is a guy named Earl Butz. Earl Butz, first of all, one of the best political appointee names you could ever imagine, right? So 1970s, he was the agricultural secretary under Nixon. Earl Butz had a dream of U.S. agriculture where we were going to plant it from fence row to fence row. And the idea was that we had all sorts of policies that pulled agricultural land out of production in order to keep prices high. And we'll talk about some of those policies later on in class. But his idea is that, look, instead of thinking about it in terms of just restricting supply in order to raise incomes, what we need to do is produce as much as possible and sell it all over the world in order to guarantee farm incomes, right? We guarantee farm incomes not by having a small number of producers and having really high trade barriers, but instead we plant fence row to fence row as much as we possibly can, and especially the things that we're relatively good at. So what are we really, really good at producing in the United States compared to everybody else? Corn. We are really good. Our farmland, especially in the Midwest, thickest topsoil in the world for producing corn. It's really great for producing corn. So that's one of the reasons why we produce so much corn is because of policies that happened under Earl Butz. Among other things, what did that cause to happen with U.S. food products? We use a lot of corn in terms of we eat corn, right? But where else do we have corn in our food products? Have you guys ever looked at frozen foods? Right? What's actually in your typical frozen pizza or frozen, whatever. Let me tell you, it's lots and lots of corn in lots of different ways, right? So a lot of the additives that we have are actually corn derivatives, right? What's the number one sweetener in the United States?
Corn syrup.
High fructose corn syrup, right? Now, lately, because of the health harms from this, and people have actually just, been able to actually pin down part of the obesity crisis in the United States to high fructose corn syrup, we've gone backwards. But the reason why everyone replaced sugar with high fructose corn syrup, guess what? We planted fence row to fence row, and we were able to figure out ways of using all this additional corn to make a lot of cheap agricultural products. So those are two of the things to keep in your mind. And on the one hand, people really want to restrict trade in order to keep incomes high, but the other thing is that we've been trying to increase incomes also just by planting more and more and finding other places to sell it. So those are the two of the goals of agricultural policy. So specifically, if we think about agricultural policy, we can think about where did these policies come from? And not unlike a lot of things, some of these have roots in the Great Depression. One of the stated goals, if you look at, let's say, the 1965 agricultural, things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act. I think that's what it's technically called. So this is the Farm Bill, one of the first farm bills of the 1960s, 1965. It had...
I'm sorry, NOA, we just had that on the U.S. Senate term. I thought it was 1909.
Well, there were other bills too, right? So this is the one, specifically from 19... So actually, this is called the Food and Agricultural Act. Sorry. So Food and Agricultural Act of 1965, right? So this one, specifically, their goals were to maintain farm income, and to stabilize farm prices. Now, this second one is particularly important when we think about the way certain policies are created. So to think about stabilization of prices, what they want to focus on partially in the textbook, and I think it's useful to go back and review this, is to think about what does the demand for most agricultural goods look like. So we're going to use our supply and demand graph, so let's say price in terms of dollars per bushel of corn, and we have number of bushels. So typical supply and demand graph is what we're going to do here, where we have price, priced in dollars per bushel, and number of bushels are there two labels for our axes. And let's say we have supply and demand for corn. What does the demand curve look like? Upward sloping or downward sloping, we can start there.
Over to the right, over to the left,
So does it slope up or slope down?
slope up.
Positively sloped or negatively sloped? Higher price means
Down.
lower quantity. Lower price means higher quantity demanded. So how much do people want? They want more when the price is lower, and they want less when the price is higher, right? Okay, so we know it's going to be negatively sloped. But then the question is it relatively steep or relatively flat? Do people buy the same amount of corn or same amount of, think about, if you go to the grocery store, same amount of flour, same amount of salt, same amount of, sugar, relatively, if it's if the price changes, or do they dramatically change the amount of, food that they buy when the price changes?
Change the amount of food, right?
Do you dramatically change the amount of food that you eat when the price changes? Think about it that way, right?
No.
Well, it depends on like how much my marginal propensity to consume goes up.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so what happens if the price of, let's say, sugar increases by 10%? Are you going to switch to, what else, what are you going to switch to?
Cheaper brand.
Mm-hmm.
Brand of sugar, it's all sugar costs 10% more.
Okay.
Well, I was
The
thinking
one
like,
that's bought in America. Is that what you're getting at? Like,
So think about just all sugar, like you walk down the aisle of Walmart, bag of like Walmart brand sugar costs $2.24 today, right? Next week you go down there and everything's like $2.48, right? And the one that's like the Domino brand is like $2.75, and next week it's going to be $3.02, right? Everything costs 10% more. Are you not going to buy sugar?
no.
No.
I still need my tea sweet.
Right, you still need whatever it is. You might cut back a little bit, but you're not going to be all that responsive. Likewise, if you think about the general category of food, you're not going to change how much you eat. You may change how fancy you eat, but you're not going to change how much you eat, right? And for that reason, we can think about the demand for food in general, for agricultural products, as being relatively inelastic. So inelastic demand simply means that quantity demanded is not very responsive to price changes. So elastic demanded, people really dramatically change how much they buy of something depending upon the price, while inelastic demand, it's relatively unresponsive. I'm not saying it's perfectly unresponsive, right? Perfectly inelastic demand would be vertical, which meant that regardless of what the price was, you just only buy that much. While here, maybe you would find some more uses for it if it's a lower price, and you'd substitute something else if it's a higher price, but generally people buy the same amount of corn. Now, let's think about supply. What's one of the key things, we're going to say upward sloping supply curve, what's one of the key things that affects the supply of any agricultural product? So do you guys ever grow anything?
Not really.
You've never tried to grow anything?
I did one time, but it did not work.
Why didn't it work? You do not have a green thumb.
No, it was just dirt. It didn't even sprout out.
So you put seeds out and nothing came up. All right.
I guess I did a Japanese plum tree once.
Oh, okay. How'd that work out?
It was actually, we moved by the time it was just starting to get big.
That's really sad.
Um,
Yeah. Was it edible plums or was it just like, okay, well, we're
my
not,
grandparents have always had Japanese plum trees, and so we decided to plant one in our backyard.
oh. I've never had one of those. I'll have to check that out. Japanese plum trees. Right now I have fig trees that like some of them, I mean, I think they're getting old, but some of them are still growing pretty well. Some of them don't look so great. I have a mandarin orange tree. I have a lemon tree. Neither of those have produced very much. And then I just put out some blueberries this year. But what's one of the things that you have to be that you have to worry about if you grow stuff?
The soil.
The soil's one thing, right? You can control that, and you can amend it, and you can kind of fix stuff. But what's one of the really hard things to actually control? Weather. You can't control the weather. So unlike a manufacturing process where you can say, look, as long as we get our inputs, we know how much output we can produce. Depending upon what the weather's like, you may get a bumper crop where you're able to produce a whole lot, or you may get it into a drought. Like think about what happened with California in the last couple of years when they had drought in the Sierras. They weren't able to get all their water, and it decreased yields dramatically. You can't really control one of the most important factors of production in producing agriculture, which is the weather. So you're going to get these wild shifts, depending upon if you get a bumper crop versus if you get a drought, depending upon what it is. And if you have fairly inelastic demand, well, what's going to happen with prices, right? You're going to get P1 one year, and you're going to be all the way down to P2 another year. And which one is better for the producer, right? So which one do you like? Do you like high prices or low prices if you're a producer?
High prices.
You like high prices, but why did you get a high price?
Because the weather was good.
Crops failed.
Because your crops failed. Wait, so you're not actually getting that much money, right? So your income, and so you can get a bumper crop, and you think, oh, that's great, I'm getting a bumper crop, unless everybody else gets a bumper crop, and then what happens? Well, the price has fallen through the floor, and you're not getting practically anything per unit of output, right? So given this, it really is kind of crappy being a farmer, right? You're dependent on the weather, and if you're doing well, then maybe if everyone else does well, you're actually going to hurt yourself. And if you do terribly, well, maybe there's going to be higher prices that's going to help you, but you practically have nothing to sell because you had really bad weather, right? So you're kind of in this catch-22 as a farmer. So when thinking about agricultural policy, they say, okay, well, let's try to maintain farm income so we actually have farmers that can be farmers and stabilize prices. Those are the two main goals of agricultural policy. So let's now talk about how do we actually implement those? How do we actually try to meet our objectives of farm policy? What sorts of policies do we implement in order to try to maintain prices and or stabilize prices and maintain incomes? Basically, there are two different kinds of policies. One is just simply referred to as price supports. I'll list three different kinds of policies. The first kind is just price supports. You pick a price, you try to keep it there. The second kind of policy are those policies that reduce supply. And historically, we've had several different kinds of those policies. And then the final kind of policy is those that increase demand. So just a simple model of price supports shows what I'm talking about with this. So again, we'll have price on the y-axis. And this time let's talk about cotton. So we'll have the cotton market. In case you're wondering, this is actually what the government does in terms of the specific implementation is going to be a little bit weird just because they do all sorts of really kind of fancy, complicated things, but the basic idea is going to be the same. So, if we think about supply and demand of cotton, with just the interaction of supply and demand, we'll get a price that's equilibrium. So I'll label that just P, or I'll do P star, and then we'll have the quantity as being Q star. Right? And with no additional government interference, this is the price and the quantity that we would see in the cotton market. However, it may be determined that that price is too low to actually support cotton farmers because, in fact, their return per acre is just so low that they can't meet their fixed costs, and you would end up losing a lot of cotton farmers. Now, in the long run, without any kind of intervention, what happens if this is too low to to be able to make a profit, right? What's going to end up happening in the long run?
Farm failures,
Farms will fail, and what would happen with the supply curve?
supply would decrease.
Supply would decrease until eventually there's going to be a price that's high enough such that some farmers are going to be there, if we have even farmers at all, right, that are farming cotton, right? If not, then they're going to get out of that and do something else, right? So ultimately, if we have some farm failures, then we get the supply curve to shift to the left and we get a higher price, right? But the government doesn't like it when farms fail, right? This is like an important thing that we have part of our identity. And it's not just us, by the way. If you talk to French people, like the French people are even crazier about this. If you ever look at like why we can't trade freely with agricultural products with the EU, it's largely because the French have this really idealized version of what it's like to be a farmer, and everyone has this connection to the land and all this sort of stuff. And, I think it's kind of nice. Like, if you have a family, if you have someone in your family has some land and you can go back to it during the summertime, talk to people that, grew up and every summer they go and milk the cows and did all this stuff. It kind of sounds nice, right? But it's not something that, we should have as part of our government policy if it's really inefficient. Anyway, so normally we just let this supply curve shift to the left if this is too low to maintain profits. However, we don't like that. Instead, what we're going to determine is that there is a specific price, and we can call this a price support, at, let's say, 51 cents a bale, or a pound, or whatever is what we're going to do. Like, we'll just call that 51 cents a bale. And a number of years ago, this was the actual rule that, the equilibrium price might be something like 37 cents, but in fact, we're going to set a price support and not allow the price to get below 51 cents, because we've determined, U.S. Department of Agriculture has determined that that is the price that will maintain these family farms. All right. Sounds great, right? Farmers get 51 cents a bale in this case for their cotton. Any problems with that?
Well, there's a gap right there between demand and supply.
Yeah, there's that gap right there. What are we going to do about that gap? Well, so supply would be all the way out here where the price support hits the supply curve. So we get this Q2 as our supply. Demand, however, you can't force people to buy cotton at a higher price, right? So the textile manufacturers don't want all that cotton. They're going to use rayon or something else instead, right? So Q2 is going to be the price. Q2 is going to be the quantity supplied. Q1 is going to be the quantity demanded. And now all of a sudden we have this gap in between, which is known as a surplus. So the problem with the price support is that at a higher than equilibrium price, we're causing the quantity supplied to be greater than the quantity demanded, Q2 being greater than Q1, and that gap in between becomes our surplus. Now, what do you do with that surplus?
Burn it.
You burn it, right? That's what they used to do with a lot of agricultural commodities. Too much cotton being produced, too much corn being produced, just set it on fire, right? Now, that may not sound like a bad idea, except when you remember who's actually supporting this price. This is tax dollars, right? So Q2 minus Q1 times the amount of the price support becomes tax revenue that has to be taken from other people that you're just essentially setting money on fire at that point, because you're buying up this extra surplus and then just setting it on fire, right? Very inefficient. Economists don't like that sort of thing. Seems rather like a bad idea to burn money, right? So this is the sort of thing that we do, though, in our agricultural policy. We create things that are supposed to maintain farm income, that are supposed to stabilize prices. Because think about it. I think now what happens if supply shifts around a little bit? Yeah, price still stays the same, right? Until supply shifts all the way above where the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded hits this hits the price support. Only up there does this price actually change. Otherwise, you have stable prices, and you have high farm income too. So that's one of the things that's problematic, is that you end up making a very inefficient policy, even though it does support this goal of agricultural policy, which is maintaining farm income and keeping prices stable. Other things that we can do is we can have these policies to reduce supply. The textbook lists several different kinds of these, one of which is the Soil Bank of 1956. So this replaced an earlier program, but all of those programs that I'm going to list here basically do very similar things. What happened after World War II? Well, during World War, go ahead. Yeah, a lot of things happened after World War II. With the economy, one of the things that we were really worried about was that, okay, during World War II, we had a lot of wages and price controls, right? You couldn't just go out there and buy sugar at the store, right? What did you have to do? You had to have a specific number, you had to have a coupon to be able to go and get it. You only got a certain amount because where was all the sugar supposed to go?
To the Dairy Boys.
Yeah, you had to send it off to the people fighting overseas, right? They're trying to protect our freedom. So they restricted the amount of sugar that was available to the U.S. market. Well, after the war, all the soldiers come home, they lift all these wage and price supports, and one of the things that happens is now we don't have that extra demand of sending it all abroad, and instead we have all these people that are going back to their farms and producing lots of sugar and lots of corn and lots of wheat and lots of everything else. And all of a sudden, you had this oversupply and you had a lot of prices that fell through the floor, right? So what they thought of was one way of fixing this is to actually set aside some of the land. So what the Soil Bank did is in the Soil Bank Act of 1956, is that it set aside land not to be farmed. And said, if you set this aside, we'll pay you a subsidy not to farm this land, so your income will still be high, but you're not going to have this negative impact on the overall prices. So we're keeping prices high, and we're still maintaining farm income because, well, we're going to give you a subsidy essentially to not farm this land, right? Well, eventually this was replaced with something that was known as like the Conservation Reserve Program. And then you had other programs like the Set Aside Program, which specifically said, set a certain amount aside. You also had what was known as payment in kind. So instead of getting cash for your land that you were setting aside, what the PIK program did was basically they had surpluses of certain goods, and then they had people that they wanted not to farm all their land on something else. So let's say they had cheese surplus, and then they had someone who was a wheat farmer, and they say, okay, set aside like 10% of your land to not grow wheat, and we will give you 300 pounds of cheese this year, right? So that you could get paid in kind rather than with cash for setting aside your farmland. All of these things, the whole idea was to take some of the massive farmland that was out there and not farm it, to keep it in reserve in some way. The conservation program was specifically designed for places that were like wetlands or ecologically vulnerable ones to try to keep soil erosion down. Because, of course, during the 1930s, not only did we have the Great Depression, which was terrible in terms of financial markets, we also had the Dust Bowl, and a lot of what they're saying is that part of what happened is that we were farming too intensively and we weren't letting trees grow and other natural ecological areas develop that would have actually kept that soil in place, right? We had too much too intensive farming programs, and we didn't have enough set aside. So all of these programs, some of them had slightly different outcomes, like some of this, you think about the payment in kind was also, trying to decrease rural poverty because they're giving people cheese and other, surplus goods. But all of this was trying to reduce the supply of farmland, therefore reducing the amount of agricultural products that were out there, right? So that's the one thing. The next kind of policy then is to increase demand. So you're either going to decrease supply or you're going to increase demand in order to keep prices higher for farmers. One of the programs that actually was implemented during the Great Depression to increase demand was food stamps. Right? We think of it as an anti-poverty program, but who actually administers the food stamp program?
Department of Agriculture.
The Department of Agriculture does, right? It was all about meeting these two goals simultaneously, which was decreasing poverty or the impact of poverty by getting people food, but also giving farmers a place to sell their food. So the idea is that you're guaranteeing a market for the farmers while at the same time guaranteeing food for poor people. So food stamp program, and then of course that later became SNAP, right? So same difference. That is the Department of Agriculture program, and actually in the U.S. Federal administration, some of the best applied economists actually work for the Department of Agriculture because they have this economic research service entity that exists in the Department of Agriculture, partially because of the food stamp program, right? So applied microeconomists that look at poverty, they're in different places in the federal government, but one of the key places is in the Department of Agriculture because of the history of this program. Other programs that are like this, things like the WIC program, right? Women, Infant, and Children program. Anyone ever seen a 5-pound block of government cheese? So there used to be certain stores that were just agricultural surplus, and you would walk in there, and I know this partially because my mother's second husband, his mom, would get food from the surplus store. The government, like in this town of like less than 5,000 people, they had one of these surplus stores, and you go in there, and they would have these blocks of like Velveeta is what it essentially looked like, and it was just cheese. It was like government cheese, and it had like a USDA stamp on it that this was surplus cheese that they would just offer in these government surplus stores during the 1980s. They eventually got rid of it, but if you, I don't know, if anyone ever listens to 80s punk, Black Flag actually has a song that talks about 5-pound blocks of cheese, bags of groceries, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's actually a reference to government cheese. So 5-pound blocks of cheese is actually what they used to do with this, right? Increase demand by like giving it to poor people, people in need of agricultural goods. The other thing is that food lunch programs are partially funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture because they are seen as one way of kind of dumping additional surplus or surplus of agricultural commodities. There's a story in the textbook about Iraqi milk powder. And in general, there's a decent amount of food aid that we give away. We didn't really talk much about international assistance. One of the things to keep in mind when you think about world poverty and U.S. government aid, right? So anti-world poverty aid, right? So aid that we give, economic assistance to other countries. Do we actually write checks for most of this? No, we don't. So if we want to give, like if you think about the amount of foreign aid we give to, let's say, a country like Iraq or even Egypt or Israel for that matter, what does this actually take? What form does it take place? What is the form that it takes?
We gave Egypt jets and stuff.
Right, so that's part of our military aid that we'll just give them jets, right? There's a story in the textbook about this Iraqi milk powder that we gave like all this like surplus milk powder as part of our economic assistance. Generally, it involves contracts with specific U.S. companies. Caterpillar, right? Why do all of U.S. allies abroad use Caterpillar moving equipment largely? It's because we say, okay, we're going to give you Israel, $100 million worth of aid, and that's going to partially take the form of equipment. Here's your boatload of Caterpillar equipment, and that's what we're going to give them, right? If we give country aid, it might be in the form of like Westinghouse refrigerators, right? It's not going to be a check usually. Usually it's for some sort of specific good. If we give food aid in particular, like my job. So one of my jobs when I was between colleges was as a longshoreman. You guys talked to you about this before. You guys know what a longshoreman is? So it's the people that load and unload ships. Okay. So my job, one of my summer jobs during this time was to load and unload, or actually to load, not to unload. To, load it up on a pallet, then they put it on a crane. They put it in the hull of the ship. This is before containerization, and to take these 110-pound bags of rice off of the pallet and stack it up inside the hull of the ship, right? What was it? It was all food aid. It was all going to Africa in the early 1990s, right? 110-pound bags of rice. It was all coming from U.S. farmers, and the whole idea behind it wasn't necessarily to help Ethiopia out, but it was to get some extra demand for our U.S. farmers. So part of our food aid, part of what we send to Iraq and Afghanistan and everybody else, is to actually encourage higher prices by giving an agricultural outlet for our products. Questions about that stuff? All right. So here's a question though: what happens to domestic farmers when we give lots of food aid? Domestic in terms of like in Ethiopia or in Iraq or something like that. Is that good for them or bad for them?
Yeah, because they would make less money then, right?
Yeah, so we think of it as being generous, and the farmers, the local farmers, think of it as one of the worst policies ever. Because if they have higher prices for their agricultural products in some of these countries, then guess what? They're going to be able to develop their agricultural sector, but instead we end up screwing it over by screwing over the sector by depressing the prices. I don't know how many of you guys were around here during Katrina, but if you talk to doctors that were in New Orleans and along the coast during right after Katrina, they hated what was going on. Because guess what happened? All these doctors and dentists and everything came down and said, we're going to help out the coast by offering our free services. So if you're an osteopath down there in Gulfport, guess what? You can't make any money for a couple of years because all these doctors have come down to donate their services and no one wants to go for the paid services instead. Right? Lawyers had the same issue on the coast for a while. So, you think of someone being generous, but in fact it ends up harming, others in that sector. Now, on net, maybe the people really needed those things and, no one's going to cry about a doctor leaving. But in fact, we did lose a lot of our doctors to the Dallas area. A lot of the doctors along the coast ended up moving to Dallas after Katrina because they couldn't make any money. All right. Last topic that I want to just kind of do a grab bag of things here. GMOs, ethanol, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So first of all, GMOs. Genetically modified organisms. You guys know what those things are?
I grow GMO
Something
cayenne
made in the
peppers.
lab.
Your cayenne peppers are GMO. How do you know they're GMO?
On the bag, it'll say when you buy seeds, it'll say not GMO if it's
Oh.
but if it doesn't say not GMO, it's,
Then it is GMO.
yeah.
Now, typically, what's the key about GMOs? Once you grow a GMO crop, what do you know you can't do afterwards?
Plant it.
You can't plant the seeds from that crop, right? So genetically modified organisms, basically the idea is that they try to improve, yeah.
You can continue. I have a question.
What's that?
I have a question. You can continue with this.
Okay, so I'll go through this and then I'll get back to you. So genetically modified organisms, so the idea is that usually they try to improve upon nature by messing with the genes in a couple particular ways. One way is that they try to make it more pest resistant in some way. Right. Or possibly pesticide or herbicide resistant. So pest resistant in some way, they try to make it unattractive to animals or insects or something that can eat it. The other thing that they do is they often make it pesticide resistant. So you have a crop that it's going to decrease its productivity if there are a lot of other plants that are trying to take its resources, right? So if you have a lot of weeds out there that are growing all around your crop, then it's not going to grow as well. So what they do is that they produce what's known as Roundup Ready crops, which you guys use Roundup. I don't know how anyone can garden in the state of Mississippi without Roundup, because they're like, this is just the most abundant in plant life place I've ever lived, because like you can't do anything without weeds. It's like, I don't know how you would ever control weeds around this campus unless we just decided to invest in $100,000 worth of Roundup every spring or something like that. Anyway, so you want to spray your Roundup there in order to prevent things that you don't like growing up. Well, the problem is that, what is wheat? What is it very much like?
Grass.
It's a grass, right? So, if you spray Roundup around your azaleas, that's no big deal because that's a woody plant. But wheat, corn, all that stuff, those are grasses, so they're going to be very much going to be affected by Roundup. But you add a gene inside your corn to make it resistant to Roundup, and then you can plant your corn. Then you can spray the rest of the field with Roundup, and guess what? You still have corn, and you don't have any weeds growing up in between it either. Likewise, you can do certain things to it to make it not very tasty to certain insects and such. Yeah, Shimon.
So you said genetically modified organisms, would that spread out to animals?
Generally, when we're talking about GMOs, we're talking about plants, because we talk about it in the food supply. But there are GMO animals that are out there as well, right? So the same sort of techniques that they use to modify a carrot and make it aggy purple or maroon or whatever they do. I don't know if you've seen these stupid ag schools, especially Texas A&M. They love doing GMO experiments and making things different colors. But you could, technically, you could change the genes within certain, cows or something, I don't know, to make it produce more. And I mean, we do other things to the cows, right? We kind of, through selective breeding processes, we create these these cows that'll consume so much grain in order to produce a ridiculous amount of meat within the first 16 months of their lives. But if you actually use it at the genetic level, you can do GMOs for animals too. Right? You guys know of any examples of that?
There's a bull that has a ton of muscles on it. I don't know if it was selective breeding or if it was from.
Yeah.
I've seen it somewhere and but it was humongous.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you could do it. I think you could do it. It's just more complicated, probably. You could do it with animals too. Now the question is this good or bad? A lot of people really hate GMOs, and this is one of these kind of human rightsy sorts of things where people get, oh, no GMO foods. The problem is that if you walk down the freezer aisle, I can tell you at Walmart you're going to have 90% of what's in your freezer is going to have some GMO, because it's going to have some corn, and 98% of the corn in the United States is GMO now, right? Something like 95% of all the soybeans in the United States is now GMO, right? It's just so ubiquitous, and no one's been able to prove reliable health harms from this. And we've been genetically modifying for years, just through selective breeding and other processes. Trying to get to the right combinations of genes to then produce a hardier variety or something else. This is just speeding up the process. Now, if someone has really good evidence, I'm not going to be a shill for Monsanto or any other company. But until you produce the evidence, I'm just not going to buy it. Right? Europe is much more anti-GMO than we are. Right? Even The Economist had an article maybe 10 years ago about frankenfoods and all sorts of clever names about this stuff.
Russia refused to accept our GMO crops. They won't let us sell them.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of countries will just use this as another form of trade protection. Right? It's more of an excuse than anything else. Now, you do have these worries about okay, what happens when the seed gets loose? What happens when things like the seeds are supposed to be sterile, right? So that you can't continue to grow this stuff. But sometimes, just like in Jurassic Park, nature finds a way, right? You never know what could happen, but it's more fear and misinformation than anything else. All right, ethanol. For a while, back when we had high oil prices, people were convinced that ethanol subsidies, that ethanol was a savior in terms of thinking about producing new fuels. So ethanol is basically fuel produced from corn. and we had been started subsidizing this to like an outrageous amount based upon one of the previous agricultural bills. So,
Hang on, quick question. Now, like fuel, you're talking about like gas?
like gasoline, right?
Okay, so like, why are people freaking out that gas is supposed to run out then?
Well, at the time,
There's another way, like.
right, there's another way, and that's they said there's another way of producing ethanol. Do you guys ever know some of the, like, I don't know that much about ethanol, but first of all, it's incredibly inefficient, right? So we were spending $6 billion a year.
I heard that it's supposed to burn cleaner than oil does.
Right, so part of what they're trying to sell is that this was environmentally better for us because it was going to be burning cleaner, right? That was the argument. So in the 2008 Farm Bill, there was $6 billion in tax credits written into it for ethanol production. Problem is that it may burn cleaner, but the net environmental impact is actually negative because the way that we grow corn can have such a negative impact on the environment through, soil erosion, through burning fossil fuels, through the combines. You have to plant and harvest all this stuff, that on net, growing it isn't any more efficient in terms of it isn't any more environmentally friendly than in fact burning fossil fuels, because it's still giving off some negative environmental. There's still some negative environmental damage, but in addition to that, the growing of it is actually a pretty dirty process. So in the 2008 Farm Bill, we put in all these tax credits, and most economists and environmental scientists that have studied this say ethanol actually isn't any better for the environment when you take into account everything that's going on. Anyway, who ended up benefiting from this, by the way? Small family farms are big agricultural producers. The big ones produce. They're the ones who got these subsidies. So oftentimes these sorts of laws are promoted saying, look at the small family farmer. He's going to go out of business if we don't do everything we can to support them. And what it typically does is just ends up supporting the large multinational agricultural conglomerates like Cargill and Monsanto does some chemical stuff more than that, but it's Cargill and who are the other ones? I'm not thinking of the names, but there are basically 4 big agricultural companies that control something like 60% of several crops in the United States at this point. So ethanol, not the best way to spend our money. It basically was another way of increasing demand for corn, and it came at the cost of the United States consumers. So TPP, this is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's basically a massive trade bill, and its goal is to increase trade amongst I think it ends up being, let's see, 4, something like 12, 13 countries. Can't really remember. And these include, some of the big ones are Chile, Vietnam, Japan, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia. And Brunei, right? The Sultanate of Brunei. Peru is in there as well. Mexico. So it takes the 3 countries in NAFTA, US, Canada, and Mexico, combines them with a couple of the biggest economies in Latin America, Chile and Peru, in terms of the Pacific side of things, and a couple of the biggest East Asian economies. You have Japan, Australia, Vietnam in there. Of course, who's not in here? Who's the big one who's not in here? China's not in here. But this is 40% of world GDP, right? So all of these combined, 40% of world GDP. So it's pretty huge. Now, some of these countries we already have a free trade area with, and we'll talk about free trade areas and such in the future in next class. US and Canada and Mexico, obviously, we do. US and Japan, we don't. right? So Japan has a very protected agricultural market, and one of the key things about the TPP is that we're opening up a lot of the Japanese agricultural market that's currently not open. So one of the things that's very big, let's just take, for example, beef, right? There's going to be, currently there's a 38.5% tariff in Japan, right? That's going to be reduced by 3/4 in 15 years because of the TPP. So that may not seem like a huge impact on U.S. trade in general, right? But for beef farmers, getting into the Japanese market is going to be a fairly important thing. So that's one of the things that it's going to do. We're also looking at getting enhanced access into Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, New Zealand, Brunei, in different ways. And over 50% of our future agricultural exports are going to be practically duty-free to all these countries. So it's a lot of little details in the TPP, and there's certain things that we're opening up our markets to as well. So there's certain things that like U.S. farmers are going to be against. One of the things is that our dairy farmers don't like the TPP. Right? Who produces a lot of dairy in this picture here?
In the U.S.
U.S. does, definitely, but as far as our trade partners, New Zealand and Australia, they both produce a decent amount of dairy as well.
Canada's also complaining about it. I follow a lot of Canadian news. I've lived in Canada for a while.
Okay, and so what's he
I've heard
complaining
the
about?
news there about it hurting dairy farmers in Canada.
Yeah, dairy farmers in Canada will also be. I mean, the thing is that right now we have this nice little U.S. Canada Mexico, like we trade amongst ourselves, but now those relatively protected dairy farmers in Vermont and in Canada and such are now going to be open to dairy imports from Australia and New Zealand. They're really happy about this, just like the U.S. beef producers are really happy about that. So it's like everybody gains a little and everybody loses a little, and so specific people like U.S. dairy farmers, Canadian dairy farmers, aren't going to be really happy about this because they're going to be one of the groups that are going to lose. But who should benefit? Going back to our very beginning of the lecture, people who buy milk will be happy. People who buy cheese. I buy cheese. I don't produce it. I will like this. This will be good for me. Good New Zealand
Dairy
cheese.
products are a lot more expensive in Canada.
Are they a lot more in Canada? Yeah. So
What's
So
weird-
people that buy dairy products in Canada should be happy about this.
What's weird about the TPP to me is that most of the time when something's opposed on both sides, conservative and Democrat, like it just doesn't get passed, and then like this went through without a problem. And like I've seen like a lot of my liberal friends say on Facebook they're freaking out about it because Malaysia's got some kind of human trafficking or some kind
Okay.
of problem like that,
Yeah.
and like I don't know if their problem with it is that Malaysia does that or that we allowed them to sign with us. Or, I don't know, something like that. I didn't really read the article, but I've seen there was one article that got shared by like 10 people I know, and I was
Yeah.
like, I don't even see how that relates.
Well, I mean, the thing is that so much of what's in the TPP isn't like, it's not even like very specific trade regulations. It's stuff like Vietnam. I was listening to this thing talking about how Vietnam is going to have to basically decrease their regulation of their pharmaceutical industry in a particular way. Or no, it's not decreasing regulation. It's going to increase their property rights such that they won't be able to make generics of U.S. pharmaceuticals that are still receiving patent protection, right? So it's not even like necessarily trade related. It has to do with property rights and intellectual property rights. So it's one of those things that like pharmaceutical companies in the U.S. love it because if they could get into the Vietnamese market, then that could allow additional sales. But it's not even specifically a trade agreement in that way, and that's why it's this. Notice trade's not in here, right? It's just a trans-Pacific partnership because there's so many layers of different kinds of regulations that are in there. So, all right, that's all I've got today. We're going to talk more about trade next time. Remember, paper due Thursday. You already did your quiz. If you, for whatever reason, didn't get your quiz done, I opened it back up to allow people to finish tonight. So
Wait, paper due this Thursday?
this Thursday.
Okay.
Yep, in 2 days.
Are you able to update my quiz?
I was able to fix the grade. If it doesn't seem like it's fixed